Hi, this is Jesper from Velocity Peak, and in today's X Particles and Cinema 4D tutorial, we're going to use the new Vertex maker inside of X Particles, and we're going to make this. So we're using Vertex maps to drive the particles and also the textures. If you want to follow along, the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. Okay, let's jump in. Okay, so let's start. To begin with, I just have this pile of rubble, or these cogs. And let me just show you how I set that up first. I'm going to go to a different file. And so I just have this cog with 4 pieces in it. And this is really part of a steampunk mask that I modeled some time ago. And I put them inside of a cloner. And I've pushed the cloner down a little closer to the floor. And then I added some randomness to this, and I just pushed them apart, just so they're not intersecting when they start. And I'm going to use a dynamic tag for this. And on the plane at the bottom, I have a collider body. So let's go to the first cylinder hole, and I'm going to add simulation and a rigid body tag. Let me drag this guy to the right side. And let me copy that to all the other ones as well, like so. And it's just going to make a few changes so this one settles quicker. I'm going to take down the bounce, up the friction to 95. And to drain the energy a little quicker, I'm going to take up the damping to just 15 and 15 for the linear and angular damping. So let's play this. And it's going to drop down to the floor. And I mean, you may have to experiment with this a little bit. I certainly did. Tried a few different setups with a random and so until I found something that I liked. But once you find something that you like, I want to convert this to regular parts. But you can't just, if I hit C on my cloner, they're actually going to jump right back up. So I'm going to undo that. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, play it through until the end. And then I am going to go in here. I'm going to select all these tags. And then I'm going to go to the cache, and I'm just going to bake this. And that's really quick. And then I'm going to play this back. And then find the frame that I want. And then I am going to make this editable by hitting C on the keyboard. And now I actually have all these individual parts that we can use. So that's how I set that up. But I'm going to use the original set that I had. Okay, so now let's move on to adding the vertex maps. And I'm going to add 2 vertex maps. One is going to drive the particles, and one is going to drive the textures. So let me go to X Particles and Utilities and XP Vertex Map. And as I understand it, this has been completely rewritten from the ground up. And it truly is fantastic. I really like this. So, for example, let me show you one thing that we can do with this one that we cannot do with the standard vertex maps in Cinema 4D. I'm going to get a mode text, and I'm just going to zoom out. It doesn't matter what it says here, but let me get just a thicker font, bold. So what we can do with this new vertex map maker from X Particles is that we can actually add vertex maps to parametric objects, which is terrific, fantastic. So for example, if I would go to select and try to create set vertex weight, which is one way that we can create a vertex map, it doesn't work because this needs to be an editable object to work. But if I go into the the XP vertex map, I can take this mode text and I can simply drag it down. And as you see, we have a vertex map. To see that, if I select the vertex map, you can see that it's red, indicating that this is a vertex map, but it's a blank one. We don't have anything on it yet. Now, one thing I do want to point out when you work with vertex maps is that they are resolution dependent. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let me go into ND so we can see the lines. We don't have a lot of segments here. So let me go into the vertex map and let me pull this up. So the way it works now is I can go to add, and then we can add all these things to interact with the vertex map. We can use explosion effects, seed objects, just like in Infectio. We can use seed maps or vertex maps, polygons, splines, textures, X particles, curvature, and ambient occlusion. So let me just add ambient occlusion, and I just want to talk a little bit about geometry and vertex maps. So I added it, and I don't see anything as of yet. Let me zoom in here. I don't see anything as of yet. But let me go back to the vertex map, and let's see. What if I try a different angle, perhaps the distance, and I don't see a change. So let me go to the mode text and up the subdivision. We start seeing something here, right? So this is very dependent on how much geometry that you have. And so I'm going to add some more subdivisions. And also the intermediate points rather than adaptive. Let's do, say, uniform. And I can up this a little bit. But the front is still an n-gon. So let's go to caps. And I am going to change the caps type from n-gon to regular grid. And we can make that a little smaller. And you can see that we are starting to get all the details. And now we could go into the vertex map maker, into ambient occlusion, and we can make adjustments to this as we need. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. But we're not going to use the mode text. We are going to use the rubble that we created in the previous step. So let me go to NC so we don't see the lines. And now these cogs are put inside of a subdivision surface. And then I also put them inside of a connect object. Now to work a little quicker, let's turn off the subdivision surface. Like so. Okay, so let's go back to the vertex map maker, and I'm just going to delete everything in here and start fresh. So instead of the mode text, I am going to use connect rubble. And then let's see, there we go. We have a vertex map. So let me click on it, and it's red. So let's go back to the vertex map maker. And the first thing I am going to use is, if I go to add, I'm going to use curvature. And you can immediately see that we have a result. So we have some settings for the curvature. We don't have a lot of settings, but we do have some settings. We can control the brightness and the contrast. And then we also have smoothing. So let me bring up the contrast to 100%. And I'm going to bring down the brightness to around -70, because I don't want to have a lot of things going on the front here or the top of the objects. I want them to be really towards the crevices. So brightness of -72 seems to be pretty good. And just going to add 2 for the smoothing. Okay, so we also have a polygon here that came by default, but I'm going to delete that. And we can also have more than one object affect this. So right now we have curvature, right? But we can also add more to this. And if you see that we have something called layers, we can blend the different objects together using blend modes. So let's do that. Let's add, for example, let's add a texture. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to create a new texture by double-clicking in the Materials Manager. Let me just open that up and pull it over here. And turn off the reflectance. And let's see. So we can see what's going on. I'm going to deselect the vertex map. And then I'm just going to put this texture onto the rubble. And then let's go in and just add a noise. And let's go into the noise. And I'm not sure we are actually seeing anything. Let me hit NQ to make sure we have materials turned on. That's NQ, or under options, materials. And then I'm just going to up the scale somewhat and then bring up the contrast just so we have something like this. And then I'm going to close this. And I'm going to hit NQ to turn off the materials. Don't need to see them. And I'm going to select the vertex map. And then let's go back to the vertex map maker. And I'm going to say add a texture. And immediately it works. Now in texture here under options, it's going to look texture tag to use. It's going to be the first tag on object. Now we can also set this to be select tag, and then we can just drag this one in like so. So now we can only see the texture. We can't see the curvature. So if we want to have them blend together, I can select the texture and I can go to the layers tab here, and I can switch to blend mode. And so we have several different ones to choose from. But what I want less. So I'm going to use the min. And now we can really only see it on these crevices, but it's less intense. So if I turn off the texture, you can see we cut off some just to get some variation in there. So that's good. Now, what I actually want to have with the particles is I want to have this come on and off. So I want like a slice of emission for the particles later on. I want to slice through here, but I don't want it to be on all the time. I want it to start here, travel through, and then go over to this side and then stop emitting. So one way we can do that is by using polygon objects. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to get a capsule. And let me put this on, say, +X. Like so. So let's see, what camera angle do I want to use? So I think I'm going to use this camera angle. A little closer. So I want to have this capsule start over here. I'm going to make it a little longer. And I can pull it up like so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to animate this capsule starting here and going to the other side. And wherever this one is touching the rubble, that's going to be the zone where the particles are being emitted. And I want to make sure it's tall enough so it covers the top cog here, and it is. I think it's a little too thick. So what we can do is we go into coordinates. We can, this is going to be the Z. We can shrink this a little bit. So it's a little skinnier, something like that. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to keyframe this. So on frame 0, I'm going to set a keyframe. And then I'm going to go to frame 90. And I'm just going to pull it through. And I want to make sure that this is all the way through, like so. And set another keyframe. And then I want to make sure this is also a linear animation. So let's right click, animation, show track. I'm just going to make all these linear by clicking this button here. Like that. And I also want to hide it as it travels through. So let me, if I right click and go to render tags and display, I'm going to use shading mode lines. So now we can see it as it passes through. Okay, so let's stop at that frame. So let's go back to the Vertex map maker. And under the object tab, I'm going to go and I'm going to add a polygons. And I'm going to turn off the rest of this stuff for now. And I'm going to put that at the bottom. And I need to tell xparticles what polygon object I want to use. If I go to options, I can just simply take this capsule and drag it down. And we can't see anything because we need to have the vertex map selected. So let's select it. And you can see something happened. So we have yellow on this side and yellow on this side. And that's because by default, this is going to use the surface of the object. That could be handy from time to time. So if you wanted to have like a finer range, you can tighten this up or you can expand this as you want. But we can also use the volume, and that's what I'm going to use. I'm going to use the volume for this. So that looks pretty good. Now I do want to smooth this out. So if I go to effects, I can just add a little bit of smoothing perhaps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. So now I want to combine all these things together. So it's going to be a fairly subtle effect in the end. So I'm going to keep polygons, the bottom object here, as is. I'm going to go to curvature, and I'm going to enable that. So to have these interact together, we go to the Layers tab, and instead of blend mode normal, I'm going to set this to minimum. So now you can see that this is only happening wherever that capsule is traveling. And let's also enable the texture, which is going to make it even more subtle. And we have that set to minimum as well. So now we have this as a matte for the particles to use. It's only going to emit where we have yellow areas. And I want to remind you that this could be done to a polygonal object, I mean to a parametric object as well, which is quite amazing. So that's the first vertex map. Now I want to name this vertex map. So if I select this one here, there is a name. We call this VM source by default, but let's call this one Vertex Particles. And then you're going to see that this is going to correspond to this vertex map that's been created. Now I'm going to duplicate this vertex map. So I'm going to hold down Control and make a copy. And let's name these as well. Vertex map particles. And then this guy is going to be for the materials. So materials, like so. And let's rename this right away. So vertex, and this is going to be materials. And then we want to double check, make sure that this one took particles, materials. So now we have two separate vertex maps. And that we can reuse most things that we used before. With one major difference. I want the material to transfer at the same time as the particles are emitted, but I want that to stay. I don't want it to stop. So I want to have the new materials stay on the object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to this materials, and I'm just going to create a cube. And let's see. And let me also do the same thing. Let me go to render tags and display and use a lines on that guy. And I want to make sure that this one is big enough to encompass the entire rubble, which it is, but it doesn't need to be that tall. Perhaps like that. And I'm going to use the volume of this cube. And so now I'm going to leave it here. This is going to be on frame 90. And then let's set a keyframe for my cube. And that's going to be on the Z. So let's set a keyframe. Not for the size, but for the position. And then I'm going to go back to 0. And I'm going to pull this one this way. And you may have to experiment a little bit if you want material to overlap like this, or if you want it to lag behind. You may want to have it lag behind a little bit if you want the particles to appear to drive the whole thing, or you can have it a little sooner if you want it to seem like the material is driving the particles. So that's a choice you have to make. But I'm just going to set it right there and click keyframe. And I want to make sure this is a linear keyframe as well. So let's go to animation, show track, and let's make this a linear like so. So now let's play back, make sure it works. And it does. It's a little slow, but it works. So let's take a look at this vertex map now for materials. So as you can see, as I play this, the material is coming on. Oh, we haven't actually changed anything. So let's go and change this. So for the vertex map for materials, let's go to Object. And instead of the capsule, let's go to Polygons, Options, and let's delete the capsule. And instead, let's get the cube. And now you can see that the material is going to stay on the object. Perfect. And that's essentially it for the vertex maps. We now have two different maps that we can use for both the materials and for the emission of particles. So let's clean up the scene a little bit. Let's call this one vertex drivers. And let's put them in there, like so. And we don't need to see them, so I can actually hide them. And let's go and let's get a XP system. And I kind of prefer to have that below, so let's do that. And in the XP system, let's go to the emitter. And let's start with the object tab. So in the object tab, I'm going to go and I'm going to select object for the emitter shape. And the object that we're going to be emitting from is going to be the connect rubble. And then we can use a selection. And I want to make sure that I use the correct one, which is going to be vertex map for vertex particles. Let's drag that in. And I do want to emit from just a polygon area. So let's set that to polygon area. And to make sure we can actually see this, let's go to display. And I'm going to set this, instead of dots for the editor display, let's set this to a circle. And while we're at it, we might as well change the colors as well. So instead of a single color, I'm going to go to gradient random. And we can just use that later on when we color the particles. So I'm just going to pull down the middle knots and set this blue one to black. And let's go to the emission tab. And let's just take down the speed to 0. Let's just play it back and see what we get. So you can see that they're being born. And they're only being born where we have that vertex map. Now, what I want to have is I want them to die after a certain period of time. So I'm going to set, instead of full lifespan, I'm going to say a lifespan of 90 with a variation of 20. And we're going to add some scaling to this so they don't just stop existing. Let's leave the birth rate at 1,000 for now as we work. I'm going to up this to 40,000 when we actually render this. And I'm going to set these to be really small, 0.1 with a variation of 0.1. So that can be anywhere in between 0 and 0.2. So let me zoom in and see what we get. So they're being born. And it is a little slow, but the result is actually worth it. Okay, so now some of them are going to be dying. Okay. Good. Okay, so let's start having these particles be a little bit more lifelike. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some gravity to the scene. So let's go to modifiers and then motion modifiers, and let's add gravity. And 981 is too strong. It's going to happen too fast. So let's set it to 100. And now they're going to fall down. But of course, they're not reacting with the floor, and they're not reacting with the object. So let's add some colliding tags to this. Let's start with the floor. I'm going to do X particles tags, and let's do a XP collider. And I'm going to set the friction to 20. So bounce 20 and friction 20. You may want to play with the friction as you add the material, because the friction should ideally match the type of material that you have. I could probably have done a better job of that in my example, but okay. And then let's take this one and add it as well to the connect rubble. So I'm going to control drag that. And then let's play back and see what we get. So they are dropping down, and now they are reacting with the floor, and it works. Good. Let's give them some more life. And I'm going to do that by going to the dynamics options, and I'm going to add a fluid effects. Now, this obviously isn't fluids, but I'm going to use that. And let me just play it back. You may notice that they are going to explode and take off. You can see so they took off there. And that's because of the internal and external pressure, which all fluids have. But I'm going to set this to 0 and 0 so that they don't explode out. And just going to leave it at that. It's going to give us a little bit more life to the particles, like so. You can see that they're moving around just a little bit more. Now, to increase this, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to add some turbulence. So let me go to modifiers, motion, modifiers, and then let's do XP turbulence. And I want this to be really, really, really tiny. So scale of 1 and a strength of 1. Just want a hint. If you do too much, it's going to appear like they are traveling on the floor. And you could potentially also counteract that with some more friction, but I'm going to leave that at a very low value. Just a little bit more live, like so. And let me zoom in here. I'm not sure if you can see, but they are intersecting. And I'm going to use another modifiers with this new XP particles release. If I go to motion modifiers and then I go to XP push apart, this is a really, really good new modifier as well. Now, I'm going to change the distance mode from absolute to use particle radius. So now it's going to respect the radius of each and every particle that we have. And if you remember, they are going to be between 0 and 0.2. So now they're not going to intersect, but they're still clumping together like a fluid, which is great. So one more thing that I want to do is I don't want them to all of a sudden disappear. I want them to gradually decrease in size. So we can do that with just a scale modifier. There's several different ways you can do it, different approaches you can take to do this. But a very straightforward approach is to use a scale modifier. So let's do that. Let me go to modifiers, and then we can go to control modifiers. And then we have XP scale. And so the parameter to change, I'm going to keep particle radius. The operation, we are going to change this value over time, but what we're going to do, we're going to do relative. And when you do relative, it's going to respect the actual size of the particles. And I'm going to set this to, right now it's setting to 5%, so it's going to get bigger, but I want this to be smaller. And remember, our particles are so small to begin with, so we need to go mild on this value. So I'm going to do minus 0.35%. And I don't want to clamp to any limit, so I'm going to just uncheck that, so no radius limit. So now that we play this back, it's going to continue to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And instead of just disappearing, they're going to appear to just scale down and then disappear that way. And there you go. Great. So that is the base for the particle setups. And now what I want to do is I want to cache this, and I want to add a lot more particles. So let me go back to my emitter. And for the display, I'm going to set it back to dots. And under emission, let's up this. Instead of 1,000, let's do 40,000. And then I want to cache this. So to cache this, I'm going to go to xparticles and get an XP cache object. And I'm going to cache these to external files. Let me just do that quickly. So I'm going to go to my media drive. I have a folder for xparticles caches. Do that one and build this cache. And I'll be back once this is cached. Okay, so the cache is done, and let's play back and see what we get. So the particles come on from the left side, are traveling further and further to the right, and then they're gonna scale down and eventually die. And it's working, good. So that's the main particle setup. Now, in terms of texturing, I built all the textures outside of Cinema 4D, so I brought them in as image textures, except for the particles themselves. But I want to show you how you can use the Vertex maps now to set up your textures. So I'm going to quickly show you one of the textures here, which is the most complex texture. And essentially, I have two materials, two textures, and that I combine, and I add some emission as well. And this is set up with a triplanar setup. But the main thing is this. So here is where I blend the two textures with a mix shader. And then I am driving this with the vertex map and an attributes node. So let me show you how I set that up. So let's add a temporary material to the floor, just so it's not empty. Add that to the floor. And let's see, I also have to enable some lighting so we can actually see something. So I'm going to do this, okay? And then let me open, or actually let me create Cycles 4D. Let me create an object material. And let me go into that material. Okay, so this is how you blend materials. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to create two colors that look different enough that we can tell them apart. So let me make this a purple color of some sort, like so. And then let's make a copy. Control drag that out. Let's just make a different color so we can tell them apart. And to blend two colors now, we right click and say shader, and we want a mix shader. So I'm going to pipe this into shader 2, this into shader 1, and then I'm going to put this into the surface. So to blend between these, I am going to use the factor input now. And let me get some space. So what you can do is that you can take the vertex map, the correct one, which is the material one, and you can simply drag it in. And then when I do that, we get an attribute node, but we also get an attribute tag on the object. And if I select that, you can see that we have vertex materials, and that name should correspond with the node here, vertex materials. It sets that up for you automatically, but if you swap them out, you may need to make sure that they match. So with that set up, we can simply just take the factor and put that inside of the mix shader, and now it's going to mix between these two materials based on that vertex map. So let me just show you what that's going to look like. If I open my Cycles 4D real-time preview, and maybe set this down to 75. And we also need to apply the material. So let's get this onto the rubble and make sure it's on the right side. And also let's make sure that we actually have some lighting going on. We need to turn this on. So there you have it. So you can see the green color is the main material, and then we have this purple, which is driven by the vertex map. So that's how that works. And obviously this isn't the actual example, but I'm going to show you also how I set up the particles. So I'm going to go to Cycles 4D, just to surface, and then emission. And then let's go into that emission. And let me pull this over to this side. And I want to use the colors we set up in the emitter. So I'm going to right click and say input particle info. This is one of the strengths of using Cycles 4D with X particles, and you get all these data points. And I'm going to take the color, but I'm going to put it inside of a ramp so we can colorize this. This is the black to white ramp random that we set up before. And so just going to make some colors here, random colors. I used blue in the early example, so I'm going to use that here as well. Some kind of blue color. And then blue on this side as well. Let's just change the hue slightly like that. And if I enable my real-time preview, let's make this smaller so we can actually see both things at the same time. Scale this down like so. And then we need to apply this. Oops, this is not working out as I want. We also need to apply this to the emitter. And we need to also right-click and go to Cycles 4D tags and add an instance. And so now we can see some particles. Let me zoom in a little bit. Like so. So I also added something I like to do with particles a lot, especially when you have a lot of particles. I like to have like a hot area where they overlap. It's going to be hotter. We can do that with an add shader and transparency. So I'm going to do shader, a transparent shader down here. And I'm going to get another shader. And instead of a mix shader, add shader. So these are both added on top of each other. So if I put the emission here and then this, they're going to be blended together. I, in general, like to do that. We're going to start getting these nice hot spots. You can see that where they're overlapping is getting hotter. And you can control that, of course, with the emission strength. So if I wanted to have that a little bit more accentuated or exaggerated, just up the emission strength. But that's essentially it. So that's how it works to set this up. Now, I also want to show you how you can use the vertex map in Redshift. Okay, so to set this up in Redshift is also easy. Let me just remove all the cycles objects. So let me remove that and that cycles material and that cycles material. Turn off that soft box, or I think Redshift is going to give us an error. And I do have a temporary floor material for Redshift as well. And let's go ahead and build the Redshift material now. So Redshift materials, material. Let's go into that material and let's make sure we put that onto the rubble. Make sure it's on the right side. It is. And let's just make two distinct colors so we can tell them apart, like red. And then control drag that to make a copy. And then make this different, like blue perhaps. Good. To blend them in Redshift, just use the material blender. Put that color into base material and then do this one into layer 1, layer color 1. And this goes into the output. So to use the vertex map now as the deciding factor, let's search for vertex. And we want to use this guy, the vertex attribute. And we want to make sure that we pull in the correct vertex map into this field. So it should be this one. Let's do, yep, the material ones. So now we just pipe this into the material blender, layer 1, and as the blend color. And let's take a look. Let's open the Redshift render view. And it's a little big. Let's lay it back. And yeah, there you have it. That's how we can use the vertex maps with Redshift. And that brings this tutorial to an end. Let me know in the comments what you think of the new Vertex Maker from Xparticles. And if you found some value in this, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next tutorial. The files are available on velocitypeak.com, and there are two versions, one that has the textures included as well. Thank you for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.